The Temple Wars. Today, we explore a part of Japanese history when temples fought each other. Monks would tear up the streets of Kyoto and even sabotage each other, and much more. In the early medieval period, Japanese Buddhism underwent a transformation. Temples, once centers of meditation and learning, as we think of them today, really, would evolve into powerful political and sometimes military institutions. This shift gave rise to a new figure in Japanese history, the Sohei, or warrior monk, which, by the way, is such a cool concept. A monk who's also a warrior. It's just so cool. Anyway, by the 12th century, many temples had accumulated vast estates across Japan, often exempt from taxation and legal oversight due to their status in society. So with these lands and increased power came conflict, as it always does, both with the central authorities as well as rival religious institutions. So to defend their holdings, the temples initially hired guards. But over time, they would organize their own militias, and eventually, the monks themselves would take up arms. Now, the warrior monks were trained in the use of weapons such as the naginata, which is like a spear with a blade at the end, easier to show a picture, as well as bows and swords. Some took part in major battles, others in more local skirmishes. But the temples became more and more fortified complexes, not just centers of faith anymore, but for some of them, military outposts in all but name. Among the most prominent of these militant temples and institutions were Enryaku-ji, located on Mount Hiei, as well as Mii-dera, which was situated at the base of the mountain. Now, both of these temples were affiliated with the Tendai sect of Buddhism, but they had a rivalry between them that ran deep, in part due to doctrinal disputes, as well as control over imperial rights and territorial ambition. Historical records document repeated violent clashes between the two. In 1039, monks from Enryaku-ji attacked and burned parts of Mii-dera, including key structures within its compound. It's likely that this could include archives and even some ritual documents and spiritual documents, which is crazy to think about, that monks would do sabotage and burn holy texts and temples. It's crazy. But the violence between the temples was not limited to isolated raids. Armed monks would frequently descend down into Kyoto, carrying mikoshi, portable shrines, to protest any perceived political slights. And these protests would sometimes turn into violent demonstrations or straight up escalate into retaliatory strikes between the temples back and forth. Now, at this point, the temples were no longer just spiritual centers. They had also become political actors and were willing to use force to secure their own interests, which is crazy. It's so cool. But anyway, throughout the Kamakura and Muromachi periods of Japan, the temples kept expanding their role beyond the religious. Again, many became landowners and would oversee agricultural estates and extract taxes from the peasants who worked for them. And again, the temples would often enjoy these legal exemptions due to their status, which also allowed them to operate with a huge degree of autonomy, which in turn just empowered them to create these bureaucratic structures and maintain standing armies, as well as begin to exert influence over regional governance even. So these temples just kept growing more powerful within their granted autonomy and freedom. And one of these examples was the huge temple Enryaku-ji, which maintained thousands of affiliated monks and could mobilize a large number of armed retainers at any point. Enryaku-ji would often regularly send envoys to the imperial court, as well as the shogunate. And it was not uncommon for temple leaders to leverage their military strength in political negotiations. This politicization of religion created a pretty volatile situation in Kyoto, where the temples were increasingly seen as quasi-feudal lords, wielding both spiritual authority and material power, a combination that a few samurai or warlords could match. So they became a really big player in the power structure of Kyoto at this time. But as these powers shifted back and forth, it became fragile. And that fragile power, or balance of power, collapsed in 1467 with the outbreak of the Ōnin War, a succession dispute that spiraled into a prolonged civil conflict. Now, Kyoto would go on to become the primary battleground for this war. The city was divided into different factions who were loyal to different branches of the Ashikaga shogunate. And after 10 years of fighting, much of the capital had been reduced to ruin. And temples, while not initially the main instigators, if you will, became increasingly involved in this war as it dragged on. Some would support one side, others the other. And then some temples would take advantage of the power vacuum during the conflict to settle long-standing disputes. Now, coming back to the temple from earlier that we keep hearing about because it was so huge, Enryaku-ji, they expanded their military capabilities during this period. Smaller temples, on the other hand, would engage in skirmishes and land grabs, trying to get as much as they could. And the distinction between what were temples and to some extent what were castles, given how fortified these temples were, became increasingly unclear. But by the end of the Ōnin War in 1477, Kyoto was just devastated. But rather than being weakened, many temples emerged from that chaos more powerful than ever, filling the void left behind by the shattered political order of the Ashikaga shogunate. But then, by the late 15th century, the influence of religious institutions in Kyoto had reached a critical point. Temples exercised economic, political, and military power, often independent of both the imperial court and the shogunate now. They were their own standalone player, and they were a force to be reckoned with. Within this setup, Enryaku-ji, once again, stood at the apex of this system. Isn't that just an awesome word? Apex. They were the top predator. They were at the top. And with its vast outlook from Mount Hiei, both geographically and symbolically, Enryaku-ji became the sign of temple power. And they would continually refuse to serve any warlords, and would maintain a heavily fortified position and keep enforcing their policy of autonomy. So across the country, as local daimyo sought to consolidate their power, these temples were increasingly becoming viewed not as allies, but as major obstacles. And this leads us to the point where the temple wars, which had initially been between temples and monks fighting, was about to enter a new phase, one in which the state would confront religion with overwhelming force. So in 1571, Oda Nobunaga would lead a campaign to eliminate the biggest, most defiant of the temples, Enryaku-ji. And to learn more about that, you can check out this video next. See ya.